Whispers of the Hollow, the town that time forgot. Chapter 1. The town. That time forgot Clearwater, a quaint town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Its cobblestone streets and Victorian-style homes gave it a charm straight out of a postcard. But the locals whispered of its darker side, tales of strange disappearances and shadowy figures. Tourists came and went, charmed by the scenery, but only the residents knew the truth. Clearwater had secrets best left undisturbed. Lila Cooper, a young journalist fresh out of college, arrived in Clearwater with a single mission: write an article about small-town life. She planned to stay a week, maybe 2. The town's eerie quiet and peculiar residents intrigued her. From the moment she checked into the local inn, run by the elderly but sharp-eyed Mrs. Hargrove, she felt an unease she couldn't explain. Mrs. Hargrove's cryptic warning echoed in her ears. "Don't wander too far after dark, dear. This town, it's got its ways." Chapter 2. Whispers in the Woods. Lila wasn't the only newcomer. Jackson, a drifter with a knack for fixing things, had arrived a few weeks before her. He'd taken up work at the town's only gas station. His gruff demeanor and reluctance to talk about his past didn't help him fit in, but he seemed to like it that way. Lila noticed him early on, often staring out into the dense woods surrounding Clearwater, as if expecting something. It was during one of her late afternoon walks that Lila first heard it. A faint whisper carried by the wind, coming from the woods. She turned, expecting to see someone, but there was only the rustling of leaves. When she mentioned it to Mrs. Hargrove, the woman's face turned pale. "Don't go looking for trouble. Lila, not everything that's lost wants to be found." Chapter 3. The Disappearance. 2 days later, a teenage boy named Caleb went missing. He'd been hiking with friends but never returned. The town sheriff, an aging man named Roy Connors, organized a search party. Lila volunteered, eager to help and maybe uncover a story. Jackson joined too, his face grim but determined. The search led them deep into the woods, past an area the locals called Dead Man's Hollow. There they found Caleb's backpack, and nothing else. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but when Lila mentioned them, the others brushed it off, as the wind. Only Jackson seemed to share her unease. Chapter 4. The forgotten ritual. Over the next few days, Lila dug into Clearwater's history. At the library, she discovered old newspaper clippings about similar disappearances dating back decades. The name Dead Man's Hollow appeared often, along with references to a ritual called the Offering. Mrs. Hargrove filled in the gaps. "It's an old legend," she said reluctantly. "They say the Hollow demands a life every few years. If it doesn't get one, well, bad things happen." "What kind of bad things?" Lila pressed. "Floods, fires, sickness, you name it." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes gleamed with unshed tears. "It's not something we talk about. Best you leave it alone." Chapter 5. The Gathering. Storm ignoring. Mrs. Hargrove's advice, Lila and Jackson decided to investigate Dead Man's Hollow. They enlisted the help of Tommy, a local handyman who'd grown up hearing the stories, and Sarah, Caleb's older sister, desperate for answers. Armed with flashlights and a map, the group ventured into the woods under the cover of night. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening as they approached the hollow. The air grew cold, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Then they saw it, a circle of stones overgrown with moss, and in its center, an ancient altar stained dark with age. Suddenly the whispers stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Then a shadowy figure emerged from the trees. It had no face, just a void where one should have been. It moved unnaturally, gliding over the ground. Chapter 6. The Price of Survival. The figure spoke. though its voice came from everywhere and nowhere. One must stay. The hollow must be fed. Panic erupted. Sarah screamed, Tommy froze, and Jackson stepped protectively in front of Lila. "We're not leaving anyone behind," he growled. The figure's void-like face turned toward him. "If none stay, all will suffer." As the group debated, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The trees creaked ominously, and a deep rumble filled the air. It was clear the hollow wasn't bluffing. Chapter 7. Sacrifice. "I'll stay," Jackson said finally, his voice steady. Lila protested, but he silenced her with a look. "You have to tell the world about this place. People need to know." Before anyone could stop him, Jackson stepped into the circle. The shadowy figure enveloped him, and he disappeared. The trembling stopped, and the woods fell silent once more. The group stumbled back to town, too shaken to speak. Chapter 8. Aftermath. Lila wrote her article, exposing Clearwater's dark history. It made headlines, but the town's residents denied everything. Caleb was never found, and Jackson became another name on the town's long list of missing persons. Year later, Lila returned to Clearwater. The town looked the same, but it felt different. Mrs. Hargrove was gone, her inn boarded up. The gas station had a new owner, and in the woods, Dead Man's Hollow remained as ominous as ever. As Lila stood at the edge of the forest, she heard a faint whisper. This time, it called her name. Chapter 9. The Return to Darkness. Drawn by the whispers, Lila couldn't resist the urge to step into the woods. Her logical mind warned her against it, but something deeper pulled her forward. Armed with a recorder and a flashlight, she ventured into Dead Man's Hollow once more. The whispers became voices, each calling out names of the missing, Caleb, Jackson, and dozens more. Suddenly, the air around her thickened, and she felt a presence. "Why have you returned?" a voice demanded. It wasn't the shadow figure, this time but a distorted version of Jackson, his features twisted with pain. "Leave while you can." Chapter 10. The Mirror of Truth Ignoring. Jackson's warning, Lila pressed forward. In the center of the hollow, she found a mirror embedded in the ground. Its surface shimmered unnaturally. When she looked into it, she saw not her reflection, but the faces of the missing, their eyes pleading for release. The whispers crescendoed into screams. A shadow rose behind her, the same faceless figure from before. "The price has not been fully paid," it said. Lila realized that her article had drawn others to the town, increasing the hollow's hunger. Chapter 11. Allies and enemies desperate for help, Lila sought out the remaining townsfolk who might know more about the ritual. She found an unlikely ally in Sheriff Connors, who admitted he'd known about the hollow but had been too afraid to act. Together, they assembled a group of locals, including Sarah and Tommy, to confront the darkness. The group's plan was simple, yet dangerous: perform a counter-ritual to break the cycle of sacrifices. But the hollow wouldn't let them succeed without a fight. Chapter 12. The counter-ritual. Under the light of a blood moon, the group gathered at Dead Man's Hollow. They carried symbols of protection, salt, iron, and ancient incantations Mrs. Hargrove had left behind in her journals. As they began the ritual, the forest came alive with malevolent energy. Shadows darted between the trees, and the ground quaked beneath their feet. The figure appeared again, more monstrous than before, and tried to disrupt the ritual. It lashed out, taking Tommy with it. Despite their grief, the others pressed on, determined to finish what they'd started. Chapter 13. Breaking the Curse. As the final words of the ritual were spoken, the air split with a deafening roar. The shadows recoiled, and the figure dissolved into mist. The faces in the mirror faded, replaced by a serene reflection of the forest. The group had succeeded. The Hollow's curse was broken. But at what cost? Tommy was gone, and the town had lost another soul to its dark history. Chapter 14. The aftermath. Clearwater began to heal. The whispers in the woods ceased, and the town's charm returned. Lila left, but not before erecting a small memorial for the lost at the edge of Dead Man's Hollow. Her article brought attention to the town, and efforts were made to preserve its history without exploiting it. Sheriff Connors retired, replaced by someone who promised to protect the town from itself. Sarah moved away, starting fresh, but she often thought of her brother and the night they faced the darkness together. Chapter 15. A New Beginning. Years later, Lila returned to Clearwater to visit the memorial. The forest was quiet, the hollow, now overgrown and unrecognizable. Yet as she stood there, a faint whisper reached her ears. It wasn't sinister this time, but a gentle voice, thanking her for ending the cycle. Lila smiled and walked away, leaving Clearwater and its shadows behind for good. Chapter 16. The Hollow Reawakens. 10 years after the events at Dead Man's Hollow, a new family moved into Clearwater, completely unaware of the town's troubled history. The Sanders family had 2 young children, Emily and Noah, who often explored the woods despite warnings from wary neighbors. One fateful afternoon, Emily returned home alone, claiming Noah had followed the voices. When the town's residents heard the news, panic swept through Clearwater. Lila, now living miles away, received a call from Sarah, who begged her to come back. "It's happening again, Lila," she pleaded. Reluctantly, Lila packed her things and returned to the town. She had hoped to forget. Chapter 17. Old friends, new threats. Upon her return, Lila was struck by how much Clearwater had changed. The town looked prosperous, but the warmth she remembered was gone, replaced by a palpable tension. Sheriff Connors had passed away, and his successor, a pragmatic woman named Officer Delgado, was skeptical of the supernatural stories Lila shared. Lila reunited with Sarah and a few other familiar faces, including Mrs. Hargrove's granddaughter Ellie, who had inherited her grandmother's journals. Together, they formed a plan to venture into the hollow, this time prepared with modern tools and old wisdom. As they delved deeper into the woods, they discovered new horrors, symbols carved into the trees, and a pit where animal bones had been, meticulously arranged in spiraling patterns. Chapter 18. The Final Stand. The group reached the center of the hollow, where the altar now glowed faintly in the moonlight. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. As they began the counter-ritual, the shadows materialized into monstrous forms, attacking relentlessly. Emily's voice cut through the chaos, crying for help. Lila followed the sound, finding the child trapped in a shadowy tendril near the altar. In a desperate move, Lila recited an incantation from Mrs. Hargrove's journal, severing the tendril and freeing Emily. The hollow's fury intensified, but the ritual reached its climax as Ellie threw a vial of consecrated water onto the altar. The hollow erupted into blinding light, its dark energy dissolving into the air. The monstrous shadows dissipated, leaving behind a serene forest. The group, battered but alive, realized they had finally ended the hollow's reign. Chapter 19. Clearwater's Legacy. Months later, Lila published a book chronicling the history of Clearwater and the horrors of Dead Man's Hollow. The proceeds funded a memorial and educational center to preserve the town's history while warning future generations. Emily and her family moved away, grateful but shaken by their ordeal. Clearwater, now free of its dark burden, began to thrive. Lila visited often, finding solace in the town's newfound peace. Yet every time she walked near the forest's edge, she paused, listening for whispers that never came. The hollow was gone, but its story lived on, a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to disturb the balance between light and shadow.